Strides made in the economic development of many countries around the world, poverty remains a key challenge. A global initiative to take the fight against poverty beyond governments and into the business world was recently started. And to tell us more about this initiative, I'm joined by former Statistician General, Dr. Pali Lehohla, and he's here to talk to us about this main issue. And Dr. Lehohla, always a pleasure to catch up with you. And now you are consultant to the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. Please tell me more about this initiative.
The Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative has been in existence for 10 years. In the main, it tries to answer the question of poverty, which Amartya Sen defined as powerlessness, and therefore introducing the concept of multidimensionality of poverty. Over the 10 years, a lot of methodological improvements have been made in terms of methodologies, techniques, and so on, as well as applications through the statistics offices in countries. In particular, the Latin American countries actually took the lead in addressing poverty multidimensionally using these methods that have been experimented on and established by the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, in particular the Alkire-Foster method of looking at poverty as a multidimensional phenomena and therefore needs multidimensional approaches to it. For instance, lack of education, absence of health, food, shelter, and all those come together to define how poverty manifests itself.
Well, somebody might say, you know, what you've just explained to me is an interesting academic exercise, but in the real world, it doesn't matter because you see poverty, you'll know poverty when you see it on one side. And then a country such as Denmark will be cited as an example that the Danish and similar type countries know what to do, and that's why they have alleviated and probably completely eliminated poverty in their societies. Meaning, the countries with high levels of poverty, irrespective of its manifestation, also have high levels of corruption amongst the elites or in their governments. And therefore, short answer to a complex problem, fight corruption and then you
eliminate poverty.
You eliminate poverty, yes.
In part it's true because there are strong correlations between levels of corruption and poverty because corruption steals from the poor. But even in countries that are less corrupt, poverty still manifests itself for a variety of reasons where there isn't enough resource to go by to look at poverty. But this multidimensional poverty gives you the levers of what you should do first, what should follow, and where are how people migrate out of poverty. And by addressing it not as a financial or money metric or measured from a money metric view, you actually address it very, very holistically. And in countries such as Brazil, Mexico, particularly the Latin Americans, and including Bhutan, where happiness is a measure of social progress and poverty alleviation or eradication, you then have the mechanisms and the levers to deal with poverty. For instance, in South Africa, if we were to talk about poverty in South Africa, one of the missteps that we have made in fighting poverty was not to invest adequately in education. Having successfully reduced headcount poverty, that is the number of people who are poor in society, significantly from 2000 or 1996 to 2011, and of course we see some reversals to 2016. One of the things in this informing planning would have been at a point in time we should have changed gear and invested in education, following on what are the manifestations of multidimensional poverty. Well, we didn't do that.
Let's look at it then in a practical implementation sense, because you say there are specific steps that must be followed, right? And then after that, I want to go back to the comment you've just made about what happened here in South Africa. So what would be the first step? Let's say you have a country with high levels of poverty. We can go back to the old numbers. I hope you can remember. The poverty levels in South Africa, where are they at this moment?
For instance, if we look at headcount poverty, for a case like Msinga,
yes,
60 in 100 were poor in 2001. By 2011, there were 27 in 100 that were poor in a place like Msinga, and that number has been reducing over a period of time. So it is targeting that in that kind of way. But having done that, there is a point in which additional resources that impact on headcount poverty do have serious diminishing returns. And you have to change gear and invest differently. And in that respect, you have to say, how do I invest in education?
It looks like there's a logical sequence that must be followed according to this method.
Indeed,
am I right?
indeed.
So I just want you to mention, take me through the thinking and implementation process.
Well, you have to see what are the drivers of poverty.
Yeah.
And then the most significant ones, and those that get impacted. And then we should look at the less sensitive to additional money or resources spent, and implement those that are more significant. And I come back to the case of South Africa, that unemployment grew significantly as a driver of poverty between 2001 to 2010. In fact, it doubled in half the time from 2010 to 2015 as a driver of poverty. So it means there's going to be a tipping point, no doubt, for as long as unemployment still remains the key driver, and if it's not impacted, and it has not been impacted up to now, and there's no line in sight that it will be impacted, so a tipping point is unavoidable. So you need, at a point in time by 2010, to have said, now I'm shifting my resources significantly from housing, significantly from water and electricity into education, because I have now impacted those. It doesn't mean that we remove.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that we remove totally what we have done. You have now to maintain at a much more reduced level,
yes,
because similar amounts of money going in there are not going to change the needle.
Well, and those things must be done.
Yes.
Right? We're being as practical as possible here in this discussion. But somebody might argue with you, Dr. Lehohla, and say, how could you reduce investments in the provision of electricity? People may think, in any event, we've got problems with electricity. What are you talking about?
It's true.
You can't really reduce them.
It's true there are problems with that.
Yeah.
But we have to significantly target the areas where these have been impacted significantly.
Okay.
Move into education and say,
sure,
how much am I spending on education, more effective?
I want your comment on precisely that. Given what is going on with the energy situation in the country and the fact that there's more money that still has to be borrowed to provide energy security, I mean, when are we going to get to the next steps? What is your view of that situation?
Quite practically, South Africa went the wrong route.
Yeah.
We got corruption, we got all kinds of things. And these things were not attended to. Nobody looked at the numbers carefully.
Yes.
It's only now where we are starting to look, but we don't know how deep the well is. Obviously, we have to focus on energy, because those firms have to run. If they collapse, there's even going to be a greater problem. So we are in a crisis. But even in crisis, we have to plan better.
You mentioned reaching a tipping point at a certain time in South Africa if things continue the way they are. What do you think will be that point of a tipping point? At what point would there be a convergence of different factors that might lead to a tipping point? In other words, what should we look out for?
I mean, if you look at the levels of unemployment, particularly for those who are 25 and below, or rather 25 and above, and you look at this over time, the increase in that number as a proportion of the population has been very rapid and rising very, very rapidly. I can't say on what date that will happen, but it's bound to happen, because there aren't processes that are going to address that unemployment problem. There aren't processes that are significant in addressing education. Now we have the crisis of energy, which now has to take resources from wherever to ensure that the firms run. So a tipping point in South Africa is quite unavoidable.
But it would be a convergence of this.
It will be a convergence. It will be a convergence of sources.
It would be education.
It will be unemployment. It will be less resources available for education. It will be the type of education that we continue to have, because you need a generation, almost a generational change, to change the education system that we have.
Yes.
And that takes time. And we are caught in that process where now unemployment, poor education, and poverty itself are reinforcing one the other.
Talking about education, the argument is that South Africa actually invests more money in education than similar type countries.
Oh yes, you can't fault South Africa on that. 20% of the budget goes to education.
Yeah, yeah. And so what is it that we're not doing right with education? And that is one factor that is cited by many politicians when they talk education. They say, look at the number of classrooms we've built, look at the money we're spending. But there are also qualitative issues.
There are many. I mean, the family situation. I mean, the Minister of Education really has major problems because it's not about children in classroom. It's children at home. What happens at home, that influences how they will be at school. I think one of the things, while parents necessarily have to be involved in the education of their children, the practical situation is they are not, because they have to leave at 4 o'clock in the morning, be at work at 7, leave at 7, 6 in the afternoon, arrive at home at 10. There's no supervision on children. So some of the policies are things that are ideal, but are not practical because of the fundamentals that haven't shifted. And until we understand and appreciate those, and then work on them to resolve them, the landscape of education is not likely to change. So even the lens of the multidimensional poverty, that has shown significant gains in terms of housing, in terms of all those dimensions of poverty having been reduced across all municipalities, now are facing a situation where if we don't invest in the human brain, all those are being lost. That's why you saw losses in the gains we made, particularly poverty reversals from 2015. And those reversals certainly are going to continue, given the circumstances that we are in.
Well, a brief comment from you, because sometimes we think that all of these things must be done by somebody sitting somewhere who understands statistics and can formulate policy, and then if we leave it to them, they will resolve the problem. But at a certain level, individuals and communities can make a significant difference, I suppose, in provision of education.
What has to happen is the numbers and the evidence must be the trigger for action from communities. If they remain outside that, then there's no possibility. I mean, successful policies are those that technically the evidence around their implementability is solid. Financially, things are viable, and politically, they are worth mobilizing for. But we haven't had a situation where all these three things converge, even if technically the arguments are sound. But politically, we find that mobilization, public mobilization, and human participation is not in the space.
Dr. Pali Lehohla is my guest, and we invite you to engage the show using the hashtag, the Modise Network, on social media. We will be looking at the role that business should be playing in alleviating poverty in this nation and in other parts of the world.